Each of us who works in this institution, I imagine, has a favorite corner of the building that speaks to his or her heart. For me, when the reports come that the elevators are stuck, or when in need of a mid-afternoon alternative to the chocolate in our vending machines, I find myself drawn again and again to our exhibit downstairs chronicling President Kennedy's trip to Ireland. The year is 1963, and he has just given his historic speech at the Berlin Wall. We are accustomed to seeing his dry wit as he bantered with the press, but it is perhaps a measure of how warmly he was welcomed in what he refers to as not the land of my birth, but the land for which I hold the greatest affection, that he uncharacteristically laughs at his own jokes, along with a local crowd that is clearly swollen with pride at the accomplishments of this honorary native son. Let's take a look.
There are many reasons why I was anxious to accept your generous invitation and to come to this country. 8 of my grandparents left these shores and came to the United States. No country in the world has endured the hemorrhage which this island endured over a period of a few years of so many of her sons and daughters. These sons and daughters have also kept a special place in their memory of this green and misty island. So in a sense, all of them who visit Ireland come home.
I'll be bidding farewell to the land of my youth and the home that I love so well. And the mountain rank to my own native land I'll be
When my great-grandfather left here to become a cooper in East Boston, he carried nothing with him except 2 things: a strong religious faith and a strong desire for liberty. If he hadn't left, I'd be working over at the Albatross Company. Or perhaps for John V. Kelly. In any case, we are happy to be back here. Last night, I sat next to the wife of your president, so I told her I was coming to Shannon, and she immediately quoted this poem, and I wrote down the words because I thought they're beautiful. "'Tis it is the Shannon's brightly glancing stream, brightly gleaming, silent in the morning beam, oh, the sight entrancing. Thus returns from travels long, years of exile, years of pain, to see old Shannon's face again, oh, the waters glancing." Though other days may not be so bright as we look towards the future, that the brightest days will continue to be those in which we visited you here in Ireland. Not the land of my birth, but it's the land for which I hold the greatest affection, and I certainly will come back in the springtime.
As our speakers take the stage, for many of us raised Irish Catholic in this country, our image of the land of our forebears is romanticized by stories and song. Frank McCourt, who moved to Ireland at age 4 with his parents and brothers, paints a different portrait. He opens his memoir, Angela's Ashes, with these words: "When I look back on my childhood, I wonder how I survived it at all. It was, of course, a miserable childhood, the happy childhood is hardly worth your while. And worse than the ordinary miserable childhood is the miserable Irish childhood. And worse yet is the miserable Irish Catholic childhood. If in their voyage to America, John Kennedy's ancestors brought with them little more than their religious faith, Frank McCourt, at age 19, carried among his scant belongings a copy of the complete works of Shakespeare, and though perhaps unknowingly, a belief in the power of stories to change lives. In his initially ill-starred return to the United States, great literature materialized in unexpected places. He picked up a copy of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment in the ship's library, thinking it sounded like the title to a good murder mystery. And in his first days in New York City, the bartender at Costello's kicked him out after a couple of 15-cent beers with the admonishment that he'd be better off spending his time in the library than in bars like, quote, the rest of our miserable race. And so he was introduced to the New York Public Library and the poetry of Samuel Johnson. Despite being penniless, he eschewed what might have been a number of easier and certainly more lucrative professions and overcame his own lack of formal high school education to train to be a teacher, talking his way into admission at New York University, despite Sister Mary Thomas's misgivings that by enrolling in such a hotbed of communism, he would most surely lose his immortal soul. Upon graduating, he went to work for the New York City public school system. His teaching career spanned 30 years and will be the focus of the next installment of his memoir, Teacher Man, and at the heart of tonight's conversation. Moderating tonight is National Public Radio's host of Weekend Edition, Scott Simon, whose extraordinary ability as a journalist to be both witty and poignant, offering gritty reporting from worn-torn corners of the world, and sensitive and literary essays on his weekly program have earned him numerous awards. In a recent radio essay about his trip to China to adopt his baby daughter, he described how, quote, children wire you into the world through veins and chambers of your heart that seem to sprout as you hold them. Or, this evening we might add, as you teach them, as Frank McCourt once did so well for so many years.
Thank you. I think I can say it's good for both of us to be here, but it's particularly, I think, your pleasure to hear from Frank McCourt tonight. The only bare minimal qualification I bring to the role I fulfill tonight, I certainly am a fan of Frank McCourt's. My father's name was Simon. My mother is a Sullivan, from Belfast, however, which I know is a different part of Ireland altogether. But I think for those of us who've read and treasured Angela's Ashes, there is familiar territory as there is to anyone who shares the human condition. One phrase that Mr. McCourt wrote some time ago that has stayed with me forever is when you talked about when you were a child and were so poor, then you began to read Shakespeare, those words were pearls in my mouth. It reminds me, and I think one of the parts of the territory that both writers and certainly teachers share is that there are things that certainly are beyond or defy understanding. But to begin to get even to that point, they should not defy description. And that's both the province of a great teacher to try and let his or her pupils begin to know that territory and grasp it, and certainly it becomes the province of the writer to try and describe it so that people can begin to form their own conclusions and undertake their own journeys. So, a pleasure to be with you
Thank you,
tonight.
Scott.
How did you
You
become...
hear me?
Yeah, maybe we might want to move that forward. You're a teacher for 30 years, Staten Island and Manhattan, in the public schools of New York. What led you to become a teacher?
When I came to New York, I didn't have, I had no skills, I had no education. I left school when I was just before my 14th birthday, so I arrived in New York, and the only thing open to me was all kinds of menial jobs. The first one in the Biltmore Hotel in New York, which was near Grand Central Station, and then I was left.
Is this the Roosevelt?
Next to the Roosevelt.
Next to the Roosevelt. Okay.
So I didn't know what to do with myself, and I didn't like that job at all because I had to go around the lobby cleaning up after people, swizzle sticks and ashtrays and the rest of it. And I used to look at all those. It was a great gathering place for young men and women from the Ivy League schools. They'd come in by train at the Grand Central Station, which was across the street. They'd come in particularly on Thursdays and Fridays, and they're in the lobby. They're the golden people of the world, Harvard and Radcliffe and Yale and so on. I'm looking at them, and I envy them, and I lusted after them. Especially a lot of those girls had those long-legged Episcopalians, and they were irresistible to me. So, and I felt very inferior, and I was going around cleaning, I wasn't a busboy. I wasn't even a busboy. I was just cleaning up. A busboy was above me. Everybody was above me. So I didn't like that job that much, and at the same time, something else was happening to me in New York. I became very Irish. Well, you come to New York, and you're in Ireland, and you don't think too much about being Ireland, except when the schoolmasters are telling you about our 800 long years of suffering and how noble we were in occasion eruptions and revolutions, but we were always betrayed at the last minute by some dirty, rotten informer. And so, but then when I came to New York, then I began to feel I didn't know anybody, and began to go into bars on 3rd Avenue. That's how Tom was reading that part from telling you about how there was one famous bar in 3rd Avenue called Costello's, which was a great literary hangout. James Thurber did murals there. Hemingway, we used to go in. I never saw any of them. Faulkner and John O'Hara hung around there. But the first time I went in there, Tim Costello told me, "Get out of here. Go up to the library in 42nd Street, get yourself a library card." This is a great way to seduce people into drinking. So he come back when you've read Samuel Johnson's Lives of the English Poets. I didn't know, and I went up there. This was a huge discovery for me, that in America you could go to a library and get a library card, and that 42nd Street Library is the most magnificent place on the Eastern Seaboard, outside of the Kennedy Library, of course. I was and I couldn't believe that I could go in there time after time. So that kept me going with my job, and the bars on 3rd Avenue, and some Irish dance halls that I go to. And I'd read Irish newspapers like the Irish Echo and the Irish Advocate and the Irish World, and I'd listen to Irish radio programs and weep over jigs and reels, which I used to hate in Ireland, and the news from home they give it. And then I was rescued by the Chinese. Mao Zedong sent his army into Korea, and America got nervous and turned to me. Drafted me and sent me to Germany, where I spent 2 years training dogs, attack dogs, German Shepherds. So then I got out, and again, if I went looking for a job in New York, and they said, "Well, what are your particular skills?" I had one: training attack dogs. We don't have the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company has no room for you here, or Blue Cross. So then I was working on the docks, the piers, the warehouses, and I just went over to NYU one day and asked them to let me in. And the dean of admissions was just passing by the counter, and she heard me talking, and she listened, and she took me into her office and interviewed me, and she said, "Well, if you," I told her I read books. I tried to tell her I was bright. But I didn't. I was very tentative. I was very shy. But I told her I'd read books. I told her that I'd read Herman Melville. "Oh," she said, "Moby Dick?" I said, "No." "Oh," I said, "Pierre or the Ambiguities." And I found out that's a Melville book that nobody in the world but me has read. So she said she admitted me for a year on probation. If I maintained a B average, I could matriculate, and I did. And then I became a teacher. Why did I become a teacher? I didn't see myself doing anything else. I like books, and I like kids. The adult world of business and commerce didn't appeal to me. I had a job in a bank for a while, and one of the vice presidents, it was called the Manufacturers Trust Company, and one of the vice presidents tried to get me to join them. I used to work nights for them. He said, "Why don't you, when you graduate, come and work here days?" And he said, "I'll have you up to This is the way they talk in banks. I'll have you up to 5 figures in 3 years. 5 figures in 3 years. So I resisted Satan and went and became a teacher.
Thank
That's
you.
a long answer.
Oh, no,
a
that's
short question.
exactly what we're looking for. What was your first school?
My first school was at a vocational high school in Staten Island. That was the worst thing you could do in those days, going to a vocational high school. I was warned over and over again, if you're going to teach, stay away from vocational high schools. That the movie that came out around that time was called The Blackboard Jungle with Glenn Ford, and I said, oh, Christ, what am I getting myself into? Fights in the classroom. But in that movie, you see, in all the movies about teaching, there's only one class. Teachers only have one class.
Magically, yeah.
And
right.
for dramatic purposes, they have to concentrate in one class.
Yeah.
I didn't know what was ahead. I knew nothing. I didn't know what was ahead of me. Here I was. I'd never been in a high school in my life. And I knew nothing about American teenagers but what I saw in the movies, going all the way back to Andy Hardy. That's all I saw, and these clean white people in the suburbs. So then I get into this vocational high school in Staten Island, which was, there was a strong Italian population there, but there was, at that time, if you remember West Side Story, there were a lot of gang wars going on in New York. And you had these gang wars, these kids coming over. At that time, they used to come over from Brooklyn to Staten Island. So I didn't know how. I didn't know. These kids seemed very mature. The boys were big, and I didn't tell them. I was very respectful because some of them, they were on the football team. They could have broken me in two. And the girls, and I was 27 then by the time I got my college degree, and these girls were very mature, these 17 and 18-year-olds. I'm afraid that I had lascivious thoughts in my head, and you're not supposed to have that when you're a teacher. And here I'm facing these monsters, these boys that look like they're gargantuan, and the girls are so mature, and I had to adjust to all of that. Was I going to go in and start teaching English? No, here's the parts of a sentence, the subject, the predicate, and the other. No, yo, teach. Yeah, he hit me. And all this stuff is going on, and people are throwing their lunch around the room, and can I have the PS? Can I get the good PS and all that? And then I developed a whole theory about how do you deal with the past, and I got my period, and I got to go clean it, and I'm going to need a PS, and my mother is dying, and I got to go to the telephone. And, no, you can't. I wanted to be the stern teacher. Control. I didn't know. I was an nincompoop. And the only way you can, the only solution is to stay in the classroom year after year after year. But I hear of people teaching teachers how to teach. You can't. Yeah. You can't. You go into the classroom and you do it.
When did you decide, if you can, maybe in your mind it turns on a story, when you weren't going to teach defensively, but actually try and put something across to the students?
Certain things happened. I'm writing about that now, so I'm going to give the game away. Don't tell anybody.
Everyone understand that, what follows? It's absolutely between everyone here, okay?
Yeah. One of the kids, Joy Santos was his name, sticks his hand up the first day. Because I had, I don't know what I said. Hey, yo, teach, you Scotch or something? I said, no, I'm Irish. Yeah, what's Irish? You know, what they were trying to do, and I knew it then, they were trying to divert me from the lesson. I had written on the board, spelling list, and I was going to, you read off 20 words and they take them down. And they were trying, because I had done this myself as a kid in Ireland, tried to get the teacher off the subject. So this, yeah, what's Irish? Where is it? Did you play sports? What religion did you have in Ireland? You know, did you, what kind of music do you have? And did you go out, hey, yo, teach, did you go out with girls in Ireland? No, sheep. What do you think we want to do? What do you think?
Long-legged Episcopalian.
A long-legged Episcopalian. Oh, yeah. They used to go to church around the corner from me in Ireland, the Protestant church. But they started asking me these questions. Now, they were 50% sincere, and 50% trying to get me away away from the light. But they started asking, and they found me a bit exotic, I think, because of the accent and because I came from another place and I had entirely different. Yo, teach, where'd you go to high school? I never did. Yeah, it shows. Well, I'll get you, you little bastard. Report card day will come around. So all of this stuff was going on. And I don't know what I was teaching. I can't recall teaching. Because the course of study was there, you know, spelling, punctuation, reading comprehension, paragraph writing with a topic sentence. Do not let them write a paragraph. All these courses of study are made by people in an office somewhere who fled the classroom at the first possible opportunity. So you had this course of study, and I'm trying to engage in what they call classroom management, which professors of education always talk about. Classroom management. Open the window 6 inches from the top, make sure the garbage is collected. And the past, dealing with the past, and all the little dramas going on in the classroom where a couple in the back are breaking up and she's weeping and he's staring ahead and you have to go back, or two boys start fighting in the back. This is vocational high school in the late 80s and the early 60s. Two boys start fighting. And you could say, hey, hey, and in the beginning you're so stupid about classroom management. You go back and you try to break it up, but you're told by veteran teachers, let them fight. Let them take your time walking back. Wait till the blood flows, and then send for the principal. That's what they're paid for. So I'm juggling all of this stuff, and the sexuality of those kids, and their toughness, and their impatience with academic subjects, and their interest, which was genuine, their interest in me. So I began to tell stories. A lot of them were made up about Ireland and coming over and so on. And then they had the other movie that was popular on them was The Quiet Man. That was their vision of Ireland. All these stereotypes of these simple-minded Irishmen, you're fighting all over the landscape, and then all drinking pints of Guinness, and the kindly priest there and the Protestant minister over there. That's the vision. And then they'd ask me, "You're going to the St. Patrick's Day parade?" I said, "No." "You're not?" And they were very disappointed because if I was absent, they just cut class. So I had to deal with this Irishness. I didn't expect it. I thought I was going to go in there and stand up and speak most eloquently of John Donne or Shakespeare or something like that.
Well, but at some point you had made that kind of leap. At some point literature became important to you, animating to you.
Yeah.
Was there a moment, were there several moments when you began to communicate with your students that way? Good. But after all, it was part of what you loved in life.
That question about you Scotch or something, and other questions that follow like that, and then I began to introduce poetry, not the usual, because I knew they wouldn't. I knew if you were to bring in Emerson's poetry or Longfellow, they had no patience with that. So I used to give them all copies of Dangerous Dan McGrew, and we'd all chant it. Yeah, and because they were used to having English teachers that go into the deeper meaning of things.
Yeah.
The English teachers are terrible for going into the deeper meaning. They go into things the poet himself or herself would know about. So we do Dangerous Dan McGrew or The Face on the Barroom Floor or Gunga Din like that. And that was a big breakthrough for me. Yeah. Just leave them alone. Don't bother them with the deeper meaning. As a matter of fact, I used to tell them my favorite poem, as they say, my favorite poem in the whole world. My favorite poem was Little Bo Peep has lost her sheep and doesn't know where to find them. Leave them alone, they will come home, wagging their tails behind them. I think that sums up philosophy. Just don't bother people. Let them wag their tails.
You've told us several things about your students, but are there individuals that you remember very vividly even today?
I remember a lot of them. I keep meeting them. Do you mind if I use a bad word, a four-letter word?
I can't believe we haven't already.
There's a four-letter word at the end of the story.
Yeah.
And you can cover your ears. I'll do that when it's coming. I was walking up 2nd Avenue with my wife a few years ago, and this young man is walking towards me, and he said, "Hi, Mr. McCourt." I said, "Hi, Moose." "You know my name?" I said, "Yeah, Moose Klein." You know my, I said, "Yeah." He said, I was in your class 15 years. I said, "I know, Moose." So I said, "How are you doing?" I was in your writing class." I said, "I know." He said, "I was in your writing class for 1.5 years." I said, "I know." I said, "How are you doing?" "I was in your writing class, and now I'm a poet, and I'm starving, and fuck you."
Must be very rewarding to know you touched
They had
one life.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because you always hear people these lovely romantic stories of little old ladies who say, "If I thought that I just influenced one child, it was worth 30 years of my life." Oh, baloney. One child.
What sort of kids did you teach over the years, and how did you see students change from the first ones you met in Staten Island to when you came? Because Stuyvesant, of course, a lot of people here might even be familiar with that. It's considered, we can safely say, I guess, the preeminent public high school in New York.
Yeah. Well, I went from McKee, which it was pragmatic. These kids were going into plumbing and air conditioning and sheet metal work and auto mechanics and printing, that trades, and then there were the girls would go into they were going to become something called cosmetologists. I said, "What's cosmetology?" "Beauty culture." So they're going, or secretarial work. So they were as soon as they graduated, they were going for jobs. There was nobody talked about college at all.
Let me interrupt you and ask a question about that. Were there ever any occasions when you said to a youngster, "I think you ought to open your mind and heart to doing something else"?
Well, they didn't. The administration at McKee Vocational High School didn't encourage that. I remember a girl in I remember her name, Linda Sinecki. I remember saying to Linda, "Why don't you think," this is the wrong graduation, "why don't you think about college? You're bright, you're good, you write well, and you read a lot." "Oh, I never thought of it." So then I was stopped in the hallway a few days later by this guidance counselor. He's dead now, Mr. Bibberstein. He said, "What the hell are you doing?" I said, "What do you mean, what am I?" "But you're encouraging these kids to go to college." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Linda Sinecki is quite capable of going to college." He said, "You shouldn't do that. You're giving them these high expectations. They can't measure up to that." So I learned a little lesson from that. But insidiously, I would encourage kids to go to college. You don't have, because a lot of them were encouraged by their fathers, who were in the trades, in carpentry and so on. A lot of them, got this generations, generations break away from the previous generation. But at that time, there was such a mindset in educational circles about this, about plucking kids from vocational high schools and sending them to college. That wasn't encouraged.
So you eventually went to Manhattan and you found yourself teaching kids.
The next job I had was in a school called High School of Fashion Industries, in the garment center, where they had kids in cutting, tailoring, upholstery, shoemaking, all that kind of thing, and that was also a vocational school, more particular than McKee Vocational. And I didn't last there very long because I didn't get along with the chairman of the academic department. And I lasted 6 months, and then he booted me out. So I went to another school.
May I ask why you didn't get along with him?
I don't know, but I think he was one of those rigid individuals. And he didn't, for instance, he said, "What point is there?" He came into the class one day where the kids were reciting Gunga Din. "What's the point of this?" I said, he said, "Did you give them some historic background?" I said, "No, they're just enjoying the poem for itself." "Oh, well, no, yeah, then it has to be related. It has to be relevant or something." And so we parted, and then I got a job down the Lower East Side, which was another experience altogether, because there was the Lower East Side is the melting pot, the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And the kids, the established American kids were there, and they came from all. At one time it was largely a Jewish neighborhood and a Jewish school. But then you had Chinese kids. At that time, the Chinese and the Puerto Rican, and there was a lot of tension between those two groups. I mean, kids might be, if a Puerto Rican boy went out with a Chinese girl during a change of periods, he'd find a knife in his ribs, and there was abductions. It was very rough. But I learned with the kids, the immigrant kids, I learned that I had to speak clearly, slowly. And I began to understand their frustration because they wanted to be American. They wanted to be in the mainstream. They wanted to hang out like everybody else, to be American teenagers. And I had to learn how to communicate with them. And that was a lesson for me. It forced me into clarity. And then I was fairly happy there. And then I got on the elevator one, then this damn chairman for the previous school gets on. He'd just been appointed principal. He's following me around. So I didn't last long there because my wife, my then ex-wife, was teaching, and she was gone off on a maternity leave from that very same school. So this principal one day in an auditorium about the size of this, and he's up there with that podium and the microphone and everything, and I'm coming in a little late into the auditorium. So he's the master of the ritual podium. He calls to me, Mr. McCourt, are you a father yet? And all the teachers are there, 140 teachers. I said, no, not yet. He said, well, what do you want, a boy or a girl? I said, it doesn't matter to me. Well, he said, as long as it's not a neuter. Well, I said, if it is, I'll train it to grow up and be a principal. And that's why I'm not in that school anymore. So then I moved on to Stuyvesant, which was paradise.
Yeah. Well, talk about some of the kids at Stuyvesant then, if you could, for a moment.
When I went to Stuyvesant, you can imagine the adjustment I had to make from McKee, High School of Fashion, and Seward Park. I walked into this class. All of these kids in Stuyvesant are going to college. Yeah. A lot of them are going around here, Harvard and the rest of these places. And they have a huge rate of admission to highly sought-after colleges. So, and they're there, and they're sitting there, and I'm talking to them in this kind of simple baby talk that I use down in Seward Park, just to make myself clear. And you could see them looking out the window, and then I began to realize you have to raise the level of discourse. I had to start working, to go home. And if we were reading, for example, one of the books I loved to discuss with was The Scarlet Letter. I was always finding something new in The Scarlet Letter, and in the spring we do a lot of Shakespeare. So, and they had insights of. I learned a lot from them. Mm-hmm. That's the thing about teaching, that I've always said. If you're teaching and you're not learning, you're not teaching. You have to be learning while you're teaching. So I was learning. It was a shock to me that this was my education. Mm-hmm. I learned a lot about human nature and classroom management and so on in the other schools, and I learned about honesty because the kids would blurt out their feelings in a very honest way. But at Stuyvesant, I learned a lot about reading poetry, reading plays, having discussions with the kids, mm-hmm. and most of all, honesty. Because you can't get away with it. They won't let you get away with anything. They're watching you all the time. They're looking at the way you dress, and they're like heat-seeking missiles. They'll come in on you, and they force you into. And it's not. I'm not talking about honesty from any moral or ethical point of view. It's what worked in the classroom. It's what you had to be. And I think the peculiar thing, it makes you stronger. When you're honest with them and when you admit you don't know, because most of us have a tendency. Oh yeah. Initially the kids would say, "So, Mr. McCourt, what's the difference between a direct object and an indirect object?" I said, "I don't know. Go home and ask your mother, and come back here on Tuesday." So I learned eventually just admit I don't know. We'll find this out together.
Yeah. Can you help us understand that process of learning from students specifically and concretely? I'm guessing as a writer, you may have learned just as much at a vocational school in Staten Island that informs the work that you're writing today as you did in Stuyvesant, if not more.
Well, I suppose they have the teenagers, and they have the universal problems of teenagers, the feelings and the dreams and the urges and the hormonal clashes that most of us have forgotten. Oh, that at that time when I was 27, I was still fairly close to it. In many ways, I was retarded emotionally, and I wasn't as mature as many of those kids, having come from Limerick, where the favourite word of the Limerick woman was no. It was a priest-ridden city. It was the only city in Ireland, the Cork, Galway, Belfast, Dublin, all had universities. We didn't have one in Limerick then. So where there's a vacuum like that, the church took over. So Limerick was like to brag that it was the holiest city in Ireland, and we suffered from it. So this is what I brought with me when I got off the boat, so to speak, and even after 2 years in the army in Germany, where I sinned excessively, and I still have a huge confession to make. But when I stood before those kids, 5 classes a day, I had to adjust to them. I had to feel my way. I was like an animal in many ways. And I didn't have the gift of introspection or objectivity. I wasn't able to stand back after the school ended at the end of the day to say, now, what was that all about? I didn't have that. I was just caught up in it. I was just thrown into it, and I'd survived it. I survived it somehow. Because I think they gave me a break. I think I looked very young then. I looked almost like a high school student when my hair was a different color. But I looked, and I think I had a kind of innocence about me. Maybe it was stupidity, I don't know. And they gave me a break.
Was teaching ever drudgery for you?
Yeah, when you had, if you had 5 classes and you had 160 kids every day, 165 kids every day. You had paper. I was afraid to assign papers. I want you to write 250 words on a trip you took to outside the college, and any topic, or what you want to be when you grow up, that kind of thing. 250 words, and they'd hand them in. Papers of varying sizes and shapes, and you'd look at them in the beginning, and you could see they'd been written in a pizza joint around the corner. There was ketchup marks and snot marks and coffee marks and everything else. Lipstick. Some of the girls would press the paper to their lips, and you got these mouths looking up at you. And you had to try to clean up the... and then you had all these papers, 160 times 250. You had to read all these. And you have them in your bag, and you take them home. And you say, well, I'm going to do this tonight. Do the whole thing tonight. And you say, well, I'm tired. And you were. Yeah. After dealing with kids all day, you didn't want to be reading their papers. You put the bag down Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday. I'm going to do it on the weekend. But Saturday morning comes and you're worn out. Why shouldn't you go to brunch? You go to brunch and you have a couple of Bloody Marys. I'll do it in the afternoon. Then it's dinner, and then you have to go to a movie. And Sunday morning comes and you have to read the New York Times, all 9 pounds of it. And the day passes and you say, well, I'll get up early. This is like I'll get up early on Monday morning, set the clock for 3. The alarm goes off for 3, you smash it against the wall. Mr. McCourt, did you read my paper? Well, I'm giving it a second look. That's the way it went, and you had all these papers. That was drudgery. But sometimes you'd find a jewel in the mass, and you'd find gifted writers, and they're the ones you try to encourage.
What were your fellow teachers like?
In McKee, they were. We used to go out practically every Friday and have a few beers in a place around the corner from McKee, And I'd go with the English teachers and then the auto mechanics and sheet metal and plumbing teachers. And there was a great sense of community in that school with the teachers, because the shop was where the kids belonged. That's what they wanted to do. They'd stay. They had to be shooed home. The kids working in auto mechanics or machine shop, they had to be taught to take off their coats and go home. Whereas they couldn't wait to get out of the English classes. They'd be clawing at the door. So if an English teacher or a history teacher had trouble with the kid, all you had to do was go to the shop teacher, and they'd straighten them out. That was the kind of... We didn't have that at Stuyvesant, that you were on your own. That's the thing about teaching. You're on your own. Because I think if you're a young doctor, an intern, or a lawyer, you have people working with you all the time. The teacher goes into the classroom, that's it, because the people who are your supervisors are generally not qualified. Because the average length of teaching for a principal and assistant principal is 3 years. And if you're in there, who's going to help you if you're in there for 10 years? They don't know, because they find they get more money. This is the irony in American education. The farther you travel from the kids, the more you're rewarded. It puzzles me. The teachers in the trenches are paid less than some jerk drawing up a spelling list at the Board of Education.
In part, by question is prompted by where we are. Were you teaching the afternoon of November 22nd, 1960?
Yeah, I was in McKee. It was about 1:15 or something like that on a Friday afternoon, and a face appeared at my window. One of the assistant principals, and he said, "You ought to know this. I ought to know this." He wasn't telling anybody else to know. I ought to know it. You're Irish, you know. President Kennedy has been shot. I said, "Stop!" I couldn't believe it, and I was stunned. Then he convinced me the president had been shot. And I went back into the classroom, and I said, "President Kennedy's been shot." Nah, they wouldn't believe me. So that was Friday, and Monday they had closed the schools, and they came back on Tuesday morning and sneering over the idea of having. This irritated me so much. I jumped on them, sneering at the idea of having a president whose wife was named Lady Bird. She'd never be their first lady. They'd never accept Lady Bird. And that irritated.
Her name was Claudia. Is Claudia, if I'm not mistaken. Lady Bird was a nickname.
Was that right? Oh, I
believe Claudia.
I didn't know that. See, you learn.
Well, it's amazing what you learned in doing interviews too, isn't it? If I could just try and take you back to that. I was younger than I suspect your students were, but I remember that afternoon really called on the relationship between students and teachers, because we were getting the news from them, and our parents weren't around, and this was before the days of cell phone, or for that matter, before the day you had CNN blaring overhead, or dare I say, even suggest NPR. And you had what was to us this totally incomprehensible event, and the only figure representing anything like authority was our teacher. I mean, I remember in our classroom there were many youngsters who burst into tears, and then the teacher is left to deal with this unprecedented event among his or her students. I'm just wondering if any of that happened.
Well, there was a milling around outside the school afterwards, and it was very quiet out on the sidewalks. And I just went down the street with some of those teachers, and we sat at the bar and we just watched the television, and we were all mute. And then I went home, and that was it for the weekend. And then Monday morning I went to mass in Brooklyn Heights, and went back to school on Tuesday. But I don't know if it has to do with you being Irish Catholic or so, but it seemed this was the culmination of the Irish American experience. Kennedy in the White House. This is what groups aspire to. Someday we'll have an Italian and a Jew and a black and so on, even a woman maybe. And then it was too short, and you felt cheated.
Yeah.
And then the Irish Americans began to disappear from the national political scene. Mansfield was Irish. O'Neill was Irish. So yeah, all the Speaker and the Senate majority, they're all Irish. But who's there now except Teddy Kennedy on a national level? The Mayor Daley in Chicago, and there's some what's his name, an Italian I think in Boston, who's going to be here forever.
We're just, forgive me for checking my watch, but just in about 7 or 8 minutes we're going to invite questions from the audience. We'll just have people stand in line and go up to the microphone, as I recall? Okay, that's good enough. So let me wind up my part with a couple of things with you. As you look back on it, those stories you used to tell to your students about Ireland, prompted by their curiosity, looking back on it, as you told those stories over the years, at some point did you begin to write them in your head and know this is something I'm going to do?
I was scribbling in notebooks. I always wanted to write. I thought that was a supreme occupation on the face of the earth, to be a writer, to put the words together. And I was always scribbling in notebooks. But I didn't know what to write because I was ill-educated, ill-informed. I thought, because my favorite writers were English, P.G. Wodehouse and E. Phillips Oppenheimer used to write espionage novels, and Edgar Wallace. Nobody has ever heard of them. And then I would Dickens, and then I discovered Shakespeare. But I didn't know you could write about yourself. I didn't know. Nobody told us in school that the schoolmasters always made us write about noble topics like the Battle of Kinsalas or the Siege of Limerick or that dirty, rotten bastard Cromwell and the terrible things he did to the children of Drogheda and so on. Nobody ever said to us, write about yourself, write about your family. No, we didn't know we were worthless. Our concerns were irrelevant to the world, so I didn't know. I wouldn't. Besides, I would have been ashamed to write about the way I grew up. Even later on, when we were all in New York, my mother used to say, "Forget it, forget the past. You're in America now." She would have been, if she had lived, she would have been ashamed of the stuff that I wrote. So, but all the time I started scribbling things in notebooks about things that she said, things the neighbors said. I made a list of streets in Limerick. I wanted to fix them. One day I made a list of food, which was a very short list in Limerick. So I was getting all this stuff and sayings and putting down things about my father and the family. But then when I started writing Angela's Ashes, I didn't use the notebooks at all. I just started writing. But I want all the time while I was teaching, I was teaching maybe with my left hand and wishing I could be somewhere writing. But I didn't have the courage to just say, the hell with that, I'll become a waiter and work 3 or 4 hours a day and I'll get fed and I'll just live in a furniture. I didn't have the courage to do that because I know people who did it, but they usually came from the middle classes. They're like kids in the 80s and 70s, affected poverty that slashed their jeans and swear, "Oh, that look cool, man." So I didn't have the courage to just go off and write. And the 30 years of teaching, actually it was more than 30 years because I did a lot of substitute teaching. It drains you. You don't have any energy of that kind, intellectual, emotional, artistic energy when you go home at the end of the day. And I always say, well, I'll do it in the summertime. But generally during the summertime I had to take courses to get up to the next salary step or just to live. I had to get a job to subsidize my princely pedagogue's income.
Yeah. Well, and I mean this question with respect. Were you an ambitious teacher, a teacher that wanted to put yourself across to students, make a difference?
Yeah, if you don't, you're dead. There were days I was like a dog straining at the leash that I wanted to get into the classroom because it was something I discovered, something I wanted to say, some idea you want you to get into the classroom. That's the thing. Kids know enthusiasm, and they love it when the teacher's enthusiastic. There was a man in Stuyvesant, Jacob Ergang, who used to teach economics, which is the driest subject on earth, I suppose. But he used to get excited. He'd jump up and down, and the kids loved the show that he put on. And I felt the same way when I would get into when we get to, I don't know, any topic, poetry or drama or anything. I'd get excited, and I wanted to get into the classroom. And I suppose it was infectious. I hope it was. And it's the energy you get from that. I know from earlier times when I tried to teach things that were dry as dust. The energy is depleted, and you don't want to do it. And I found myself one day with my voice trailing away. I just couldn't talk anymore. I don't know, it was about dangling participles or something like that, which I suppose could be exciting, but I didn't know enough.
Yeah. But when you began to go din, 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 Lazarus,
Then on Thursday in Stuyvesant High School, I was always, the two things always challenged me, grammar and poetry, because as soon as you say that grammar or poetry to a high school kids, they start groaning. But I had to find a way of teaching grammar, and I had to find a way of getting into poetry. And my way towards grammar, I had them write children's books where they would explain grammar to smaller children. And that challenged them. And they wrote, then I went on from that I had them write other children's books of any kind. And here, on a given day in January, all those kids, 5 classes, 170 kids, would bring in their children's books, written, illustrated, and bound, and the room was a blaze of color. And they were so proud of it. And some of them published them. Viking Press published one of them for a lot of money. But that kind of thing, that when you're allowed, and I was allowed at Stuyvesant High School, I was allowed to do whatever I wanted. Principal just went away and left me alone. As long as the kids didn't make too much noise and disturb the principal in his office, that was the thing. Then they'd bring in visitors from other countries. But at that time, there were a lot of Japanese coming into to look down their noses at our school system. Because in those days, the Japanese education was held up as a model that we should all aspire to. And I'd have 7 Japanese men and women standing along the back wall in the classroom, and I'd say to the class, and you're not supposed to do that. Oh, we have Japanese visitors. Say hello to the Japanese visitors. And that, hi. Do you want to tell us something about the educational system in Japan? And they'd get all embarrassed and fumble, and they stop bringing Japanese visitors to my classroom.
I want to ask you one more, forgive me for checking this, one more question, and then we'll go to the questions in the assembled group here. How many students would you estimate you had over the years?
11,000 in the 30 years.
If you had to, could you remember each and every one of them, either their name or how they appeared or something about them?
Not everyone, no. I remember a lot. I keep meeting them now.
Yeah.
It's amazing, after all. I meet him on the streets of New York. I met one in Australia, in Perth, which looks like a town in Wyoming somewhere. You know, it'd be one of the big white streets where you expect Gary Cooper to come striding down. And I'm signing books, and I look up, and this young man, skinny, with these thick glasses, and his name was Adam Barth. He said, "Hi, Mr. McCourt." I said, "Adam, what are you doing here?" "I work for NASA." Oh. I said, "NASA? What Perth? What do you do?" He said, "Debris. We wait for debris to fall out of the sky." I said, "Gee, debris from spacecraft." And I said, "Well," he said, "No, you probably think that's easy." I said, "I don't know. I don't have an opinion on the matter." He said, he says, "No, it's not." He said, "It's not easy. You just don't go out and pick it up, even if somebody tells you something fell out of the heaven." It reminded me of a movie, a movie that a long time ago about Coca-Cola bottles falling out of the heavens.
Oh, sure.
Do you remember? So he says, you know,
the gods may be crazy.
The God may, yeah.
Yeah.
So he said, the Aborigines will get it first. And they fell out of the heavens, so they take it and make a little altar and venerate it. So you have to go then and negotiate with them. And it takes days, he said, because they've already made it divine, but then you have to offer the proper amount of money and assure them that it will be taken care of. It's going back to the great man in Washington or something. So that's why this is as far as they roam, these Stuyvesant kids, picking up astral debris in Earth.
And better for it for your education, I'm sure. Let me invite you folks to step to the microphone, if you could, and ask Mr. McCourt any questions you have.
Mr. McCourt, I send you salutations from Tom Siebert of McKee.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
He said to say hello.
Okay, thank you.
Had a nice dinner with him a few nights ago.
Is he living in New Jersey?
New Jersey, yeah. But it's interesting that your last comment was about debris, because reading your books, I got a sense that you're a survivor, surviving what you went through as a youth and surviving what you went through as a teacher, having been in the classroom myself. There's a lot of resonance there. But I also just got the sense, as you were mentioning, the gentleman from Perth, that to a certain extent I see your life in the sense that from Ireland you were somewhat of a debris, kind of cast out, if you will.
Garbage.
And came to these shores. And then how you described education, which I think you described it very accurately, that's what we, to a great extent, we do to students. We just let them be debris, sometimes unprocessed, coming out. And I think that's an important thing to recognize, that if you are an example of debris, the treasures are in there. And I appreciate you bringing those treasures to us through your memoirs.
Thank you.
And I'm not quite sure if I have information accurate. Are you doing another book? Is there?
Yeah, that's what I'm writing about the teaching experience.
What's the name of it?
Teacher Man.
Teacher Man.
Yeah.
I look forward to reading it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I love you.
Thank you.
Your humor, your courage. Would you please sign our books?
I will in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So far, these have been pretty easy, haven't they?
Yeah. Puffball.
I can identify to some extent with your dealing with youth and being recognized by former students. I've had a good many years working with youth in Boy Scouting and other organizations. And it is somewhat of an interesting situation when you're standing on a corner or whatever, and some young fellow comes up to you and says, "I remember you. You're the one that locked the skunk in our cabin at scout camp." Thank you for everything you've done and for your book, sir.
Thank you very much.
We weep with you in Angela's ashes. And then when it came to Tiz, there were two things I'd like you to sort of retell the audience that stand out in my mind. Now, I read it a few years ago. I had taught for 33 years. I just retired. I'm still doing some tutoring. One was the incident with the canaries, which was hilarious. The other one that really gets to the seed of teaching was when you were in Staten Island. I can't remember the whole thing, but you found the letters that some teacher had, and that's where you made the contact with the kids when they really started writing for the first time. Would you talk about those two
That
things?
was that was the big. I should have thought of that a while ago. That was the big breakthrough when I was desperate as a new teacher trying to make contact and trying to get their attention. It drives you crazy. They have a million ways of nettling you and irritating you and diverting you from. They've been at it for 12 years. They're veterans. They know teacher psychology. Till one day they were taking some kind of a quiz, and I was rooting around in the closets, and I found piles and piles of old papers and essays and letters left by generations of previous students. And I brought them. A lot of them went back to World War II. yellow and brittle and falling apart. And I started reading them, and when the kids finished the test, I started to tell them. And I would read out the kids who wrote about their, in World War II, about their brothers or their fathers who had gone off to war, and how they too, these McKee vocational kids, they couldn't wait to graduate so they could go off to war too. And names were mentioned, and a kid in my class, they raised, that's my father, that's my brother, that's my uncle, and the whole class erupted, and my 5 class erupted over this archaeological discovery. So then I thought I didn't want these papers to just fall apart, so I asked them if they'd copy them. A lot of the times the handwriting was very, but they did. They went to it, and it took 2 or 3 weeks of my 5 classes to copy all these papers. And the principal came in and wanted to know because it was very quiet. They don't like it when it's very quiet. What's going on here? The kids are all snorting dope or something. I said they're copying, and he showed some interest, but then as long as you kept them quiet, that's and the canary story. I don't know where you got that one. I don't think I wrote about that in TIS. It's in another. That was in another thing called A Couple of Blackguards that I wrote, kind of an entertainment. It's a long story, and I don't know if we have time.
Well, we'll see. Let's take a few more questions and see if we have time for the canary story. Yeah?
Hi. I was just wondering if you could comment about, I don't know if you've been in the classroom lately, or I'm a student myself, but I also teach 8th graders, and I was just wondering what you thought about education today and how maybe it has changed in the approach from when you were teaching actively.
Well, sometimes when I look back at my teaching experience, I think in a way I taught in an age of innocence, because I wouldn't want to have to deal with cell phones, for instance, and I wouldn't want to have to deal with the total wholesale plagiarism of the internet. Even when at the end of my teaching days, some of these kids couldn't write at all, were bringing in essays that could have been ascribed to Aldous Huxley and I thought, what's this? Oh, that's I said, would you sit down there and write a summary of what you wrote? What? I said, just sit down there and write a summary of what you wrote in this paper about medieval algebra or something. Just sit down and write a summary. I said, what? Oh, you telling me I didn't? Yeah, I said, I'm suggesting you didn't write this. So this is what would go on now. And the only way to deal with it is to do everything in the classroom, because the plagiarism is wholesale. But I think the teachers nowadays are up against different kinds of challenges, if you want to call them problems. No, we don't say problem anymore. We say issue. Everything is an issue now. We don't say problem anymore. So they have to deal with all the stuff that's going on, the so-called information highway, all the stuff that's coming in on kids, all the pressure to buy this and buy that and do this and behave that way. That would be very hard for a teacher. I think first of all, you'd have to do 2 things for teachers: reduce class sizes to what they are in private schools, 2 per teacher, and then pay double the money.
Yes, sir.
My name is Chris Leone. I'm a teacher at East Boston High School.
You're a saint.
I have a couple of my groupies here, as a matter of fact, a couple of my students. We just finished your book, and I started the book with a quote from you that has a 4-letter word in it, matter of fact. I saw you speak a few years ago at the Hilton with your brother for a benefit.
Yeah, oh yeah.
I asked you if you had any advice for me as far as teaching the book, because I had never taught it before. And should I put my finger up when I use the word? These are your words. You said, if you tell them to look for any deeper meaning, they're going to hit fecking rock, I believe is what you said, as a matter of fact. And I start my class with that quote before I started your book. And we just finished it, and they loved it. They're from a multicultural background, and they really identify with you and your upbringing and your struggles. And I just also want to thank you, and don't take offense to this, for converting a group of students to read a book before they see a film.
Oh.
Because they,
Yeah.
because they truly, truly enjoyed the book, and they loved it very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
I'm not a teacher, so I'm not going to ask about education. I hope you don't mind. But I read the books, and when I read Angela's Ashes, I had to stop many times because I couldn't stop crying. It was really emotional, and it was very strong to read it. And I wonder, after all these years, because I guess the image that we have after reading the books is of you and your hard childhood and all that. I wonder how you deal with that after all these years. If it's something that after it's gone for you, or if it's somehow inside you, if it stays with you for time.
Sometimes people say, well, it must be catharsis. You get it out of your system, that's the end of it. It isn't. It's especially if you're writing about it. It'll be with you forever, and you see new aspects to it. I'm writing this book about teaching now, but I'm remembering that the kids used to ask me questions, and I would tell them stories that are not in Angela's Ashes or Tis. So I'm telling some of these stories because for me, the process of arriving finally at writing these two books was started in the classroom. I think, I don't know if other teachers have had this experience. I don't know of any high school teachers who write at all. They don't have the time. So for me, I'm not saying I wrote because I was a teacher, but because I was encouraged by the kids, or often provoked by them, into talking about my life and examining things more closely and being challenged. That's the thing about teaching. In high school, more than any place else, they don't do that much in universities because they're afraid to fail. They come across some neurotic professor. So I think the teaching provoked me, or as I don't want to put myself on that level. Auden said about Yeats, "Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry." Well, those McKee kids drove me into writing.
I ask you this as if anyone else, we have a few more minutes, if anyone else has questions or just want to say something to Mr. McCourt with the opportunity, please advance to the microphones. I ask you this as a writer and a teacher. What makes a book last? What makes it worth picking up again in your life, worth a new audience finding it 10, 20, 50 years?
I suppose what I mentioned earlier, some kind of honesty, as well as some way of dealing with the language. I think we'll always read Dickens, we'll always read Chaucer. I used to say, who of all the writers I know, who's the one I'd like to sit down and have a pint with? Mm-hmm. Chaucer. I don't think I'd like to have a pint with Graham Greene. He'd get very gloomy and spiritual on me, or Shakespeare. He'd get too poetic. But I think Chaucer and I would have a merry time. And as far as the writing is concerned, they deal with the universal. There's nothing more universal than the wife of Bath, or Maud Flanders, or the great women of literature. It's rowdy stuff, and it's eloquent, and it's entertaining. We'll always read Homer for pure entertainment, and then you can dig and find other levels of meaning. But it's so vivid, and it's so true, and it deals with human silliness and frailty and heroics. That's what I read. I read the Iliad and the Odyssey all the time, and I read P.G. Wodehouse all the time. Mm-hmm. P.G. Wodehouse is by my bed. He puts me to sleep.
Great. Yeah. Mr. McCourt, Frank McCourt.